All right, can you hear me okay? All right. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I've always wanted to come and read here, so I'm excited that this is my opportunity. There is a gift horse in here. This is also dedicated to my gift horse, which would be Rob Spillman, who took a story out of my hands in 2011 and didn't give up on me. This story is called Centrifugal Force. Harold was off his meds again and we were bored, so we went over and pounded on his door until some guy we'd never seen before opened up and said, yeah, Harold was around. And we went in and went looking for him and finally found him out behind the garage, smashing up garden snails with a hammer. There was a shitload of wreckage in front of him, all kinds of shattered pieces and bodies thick and wet as snot, and he was lining more up one after another, like small brown stones on a junk piece of board. And he would say something so quiet and personal that he had to lean in close to the snail to reveal it. And then he would smile and step back, cock his right arm and swing from the shoulder so that we could almost hear the hammer cut through the air. And instead of the sound of metal on wood, there was a squelch and shower of shell. And we watched him do this for a while, nobody saying anything, and somebody whispered that maybe we should go find something else to do. But it had rained not that long ago, rained for what felt like weeks. And the sky was still untrustworthy and everybody was broke, and watching Harold bust up snails was about the only thing left to do. So we just stood around with our hands stuffed deep in our pockets, and somebody had a half-crushed pack of stolen merits. So we lit a couple up and passed them around and watched the dull sky and Harold and wiped absently at wet flecks that hit our bare arms or faces because they could have been raindrops or shrapnel. Nobody said anything. And then the sound of the hammer stopped and Harold stood upright and stretched his back and looked at the group of us gathered around. And Harold said, hey, you guys want to go walking? And we all nodded. And Harold rubbed the hammer clean on the patchy lawn and shoved the head into his back pocket so that the handle stuck out like a comb. And we all followed him to the front of the house, and then we were on the street and Harold was in the lead. And we fanned out behind him, and when he broke an antenna off a parked car, we all laughed. And then he did it again. Snapped one off a green Chevy so that he had an antenna in each hand. And we wondered how many more he might take because there were a lot of parked cars on the street. And we kept laughing until he started whipping at our arms with them hard so that the thin metal left behind welts and it was impossible to fend him off. He had one in each hand. But nobody said anything because we were pretty relieved that Harold had forgotten about the hammer. And Harold was heading toward the 7-Eleven and somehow he was always the only one who had some money. So we kept walking because we figured it was just a couple of car antennas and Harold was just a guy off his meds, and it was a Saturday in March and it was getting too late in the afternoon to do something different. We beat Harold through the store door and we were already grabbing shit to buy because at the very least we should each get one thing. And then somebody said, where the fuck is he going? And we all looked up in time to see Harold around the corner outside and cut behind the building. He hadn't even come in. And we stood there for a second waiting, and then we had no choice but to drop what was in our hands and head out. And there were a couple of 8th graders on bikes in the parking lot. We thought about punching them for fun. So we hassled them for a little while and tried half-heartedly to take one of their bikes, but they got all red-faced and rode off. And by the time we crossed the asphalt, Harold was a good block ahead of us and we had to pick up the pace. The wind had come up and the time it had taken us to walk from Harold's house, and there was a loneliness in it, and we ducked our heads. We used to know Harold when he lived someplace else with his grandma and his dad, but then his grandma died one day. And maybe Harold's dad took his dead mother to the bank to sign over a check, and there had been sort of a thing about it in the papers. Harold's dad putting his dead mother in a taxi and then wheeling her through the bank in her chair, her feet falling off the footrest and dragging limp across the floor. And then Harold's dad up and disappeared, and Harold stayed in his dead grandma's house for a while. But we figured that probably got boring because Harold moved across town into the house he lived in now with some older guys we didn't know so well. We didn't really know much about Harold either when we got right down to it, other than what we had seen or heard. But he was sometimes fun to talk to, and he always had some money, and he was willing to do just about anything. And when we went behind the building and walked through the vacant lot, Harold was still swinging the broken antennas ahead of us, and he was crossing Jackson Street in the middle of the road. Get the fuck out of the road, somebody yelled and laid on the horn. And we cut through the tall wet grass and trash that clumped together in the weeds and waited on the sidewalk while Harold kept walking and crossing. And then he was on the other side, and he was on the bridge now, the one that elevated Jackson Street over 500 feet above dry riverbed. And he dropped the antennas suddenly, as though he had just realized he was still carrying them. And we could not hear the antennas hit the ground. We just watched them fall and bounce while he kept walking. And then Harold stopped and leaned against the cement guardrail that separated the pavement and the city from the air and the trees, and we figured he was waiting for us to catch up. And maybe he was, but then he jumped up on the rail and stood on the ledge. And there was Harold with his arms out, balanced on the guardrail, walking back and forth, heel to toe, arms extended like wingspan. And a car went by and honked its horn, and then another did too. And Harold shot them both a finger and kept balancing. And there was the wind again, pushing us forward, so that we crossed Jackson without thinking. And we stood there at the end of the bridge watching. Somebody shouted from across the street, and we all looked over and saw Hooker Stacy walking on the other side, hands on her hips, and she yelled, "Hey, you got a cigarette?" Or, "Hey, you want your dick sucked?" We weren't sure which. And then she stopped too, across the street from us, on the other side of 2 lanes of steady traffic. And she dug through her dirty purse for a minute until she pulled out something and inspected it, put it in her mouth, and then fished a lighter out of the front pocket of her jeans and lit it up. And even though there were cars and noise and she wasn't on our side of the street, we could smell cigarette within seconds after she exhaled, and we all got a craving. But the stolen pack of Merits was long gone. "You should get him down from there," Hooker Stacy yelled. And we all watched her, and she was leaning back against her own guardrail now, enjoying the show. And we all tried to ignore her because we had been ignoring her for years. "Go fuck yourself," somebody from our side yelled. And we laughed because it was an old joke, but Hooker Stacy didn't even flinch, and she just stood there, leaned back against the guardrail, pulled on her cigarette, and watched us while we watched Harold. And Harold watched the narrow platform underneath his feet. "He's gonna fall," Hooker Stacy yelled back. And we watched her now, took our eyes off Harold for a minute because Harold was Harold and Hooker Stacy was something else. She was older than us, or maybe the same age, but she had never gone to school, and she looked 35 on a good day and maybe 50 on a bad one. But there was no sun out today, and she was at a distance, and from where we stood, she could have been clean and young and fresh, and we could have pretended that she was somebody different for a while if we wanted to. We started to cross the bridge to catch up with Harold, but then he changed directions and walked back our way, just turned his feet and spun himself around, left foot over right, and he was facing us again, and there was a little bit of dust and a scatter of small rocks as his rubber soles gripped, but we didn't doubt them for a second. And we had only taken a few steps onto the bridge, so we shuffled to where we had been standing before, where the ground was still solid, and we waited for him to get to us. But just before he did, he spun around and headed toward the far side again. There was a look on his face that we could not recognize, but it wasn't like we tried. And if it had been a test question, name the look on Harold's face, we would have left the question blank and opted for the next question about what Hooker Stacy said next, because we all heard it loud and clear. "I hope he falls and dies." And her face was an easy read, all smiles, even from this distance. And she kept sucking on the never-ending cigarette and watching us from across the street. Harold was on the far side now, almost to the other end of the bridge, and we could see the hammer in his back pocket still, the handle against his lower back, tapping in time with each step. And we huddled together and waited to see if Harold would jump off the guardrail when he got to the far side and head towards something else. But he came to a stop long before he got to the end, and we all waited. "He's going to jump off," Hooker Stacy yelled, and we looked for something to throw at her, but we couldn't find anything except a rock, and it was one thing to hit her, but another thing to hit her hard. So we turned our backs on her and huddled together and waited for Harold to get done, because we were hungry and it was getting later, and pretty soon it would be dark and there would be better things to do. "Just jump, Harold," Hooker Stacy yelled from across the street, and even though our backs were to her, we could still hear her loud and clear. And we wondered if Harold could too, because he stopped now completely, and he was almost to the other side, and there was probably enough soft ground to save him, even if he did listen to Hooker Stacy and did what she said. And then it was as if the clouds had been stretched until they were thin, and then they split, and the rain came suddenly in big, heavy drops, a few at a time, and then the drops halved and separated and halved again, so that the small drops pelted us at all angles, and we ducked our heads against it, and the wind got serious, and there were sirens in the distance, and part of us wondered if maybe somebody had called them on Harold, and maybe they had, but we could barely see him now through the rain, and he had gone statue still on the ledge, and we thought maybe he was just waiting it out, and then we saw him reach for the hammer in his pocket, and he pulled it out by the handle and held it against his side, and then he took a few steps backward toward the center of the bridge, and then a few more after that. And we watched him, and we thought maybe he might throw his hammer at a passing car, and they were still moving, the cars, with their lights on now and the sound of their tires sucking wet pavement for grip. And there was a gust of wind, and for a second Harold stutter-stepped. We thought we heard Hooker Stacy laugh, but then he caught his balance, and there was lightning, so that everything lit up quick, and there was no mistaking it. And then a pickup passed us, going too fast. We felt ourselves get pushed into each other by the wind. And we heard brakes lock up, and a squeal and a skid, and we had to turn and look and wait for the satisfaction of metal on metal. But it was nothing but a near miss. And then there was thunder, loud and long. And when we looked back, Harold was gone. We stood there for a long minute, all of us getting wet and cold, and the traffic kept moving beside us. And across the street, Hooker Stacy had slung her dirty purse over her arm, and she was walking in the opposite direction, back toward where we had already been. We yelled to her, "Where's Harold?" But she just kept walking as though she couldn't hear, and then she stepped off the sidewalk and onto the vacant lot, walking through the grass and the trash, and we watched her until she got too far in the dark to see. So for a while, we just stood there thinking maybe the Harold being Harold would appear someplace else, someplace farther down the street, and we would hurry to catch up with him, because even Harold was different at night, and it was Saturday night, the best one of the week. And we stood there while the light faded and the rain got weak, and in the splash of headlights we could see everything around us despite the dark, the street and the bridge and the ledge. And we were surprised at so much movement everywhere. It was as though nothing could stay still, even as we stood there and tried as hard as we could to keep the earth from spinning beneath our feet. Thank you.